11 years ago, 50,000 human soldiers walked onto their ships, said goodbye to the people who loved them, and vanished into a patch of space that swallowed light itself. No wreckage, no signal, no bodies. Command declared them dead within the year because dead was easier to file than gone. Families held funerals for people they never buried. Children grew up with photographs instead of fathers. And then last night, without warning, without so much as a flicker of static on the long-range arrays, 50,000 human beings walked off their ships again, into the same docking bays they had left from over a decade ago, wearing the same uniforms, carrying the same rifles, and not one of them had aged a single day. Somewhere out past the edge of charted space, there is a patch of nebula that both humanity and its enemies learned, the hard way, not to fly into. For 11 years, it was known simply as a graveyard, a place where a fleet went in and never came out, where 50,000 names were carved into a wall because there was nothing else left to bury. No one who studied it could explain what happened there. No one who mourned there ever got an answer. And then, without warning, without a single flicker of static on the long range, arrays to announce it, the graveyard gave every single one of them back. That is where this story begins. Not at the beginning. Not 11 years ago in the smoke and fire of a war most of you have already forgotten the name of. It begins last night, on a cold docking ring above a gray little moon called Perrin's Anchor, where a woman named Elena Voss stood behind a reinforced viewport and watched her brother's ship come home, and did not know in that moment whether to scream or to fall to her knees. She did neither. She had trained herself over 11 years not to do either. That training was about to be tested more than it had ever been tested in her life. Elena Voss was 44 years old, a colonel in what remained of the Terran Expeditionary Command, and she had spent the last decade of her life doing two things: rebuilding a fleet that had been gutted by a war nobody quite understood, and refusing to let anyone close the file on the Lyra Expeditionary Force. 50,000 souls. Her brother Daniel among them. Command had wanted to mark them KIA within 18 months of their disappearance. Elena had fought that designation for 11 years, using every ounce of political capital she had, until the official classification remained, stubbornly, painfully, missing status unconfirmed. People had stopped believing her a long time ago. She had never stopped believing herself. And now the impossible thing had happened, and she did not know what to feel, because grief and joy do not politely take turns. Sometimes they arrive together, tangled around each other like two hands gripping the same rope, and you cannot let go of one without letting go of the other. The docking bay doors opened with a groan that echoed through the whole ring, a sound built for cargo, not for miracles. And the first man to step through was not Daniel. It was a sergeant Elena did not recognize, hollow-eyed, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who has spent a very long time being told exactly how to walk, and has only just remembered he is allowed to walk however he likes. He stopped in the threshold. He looked up at the gray ceiling of the docking bay as if he had never seen a ceiling before, and then he began, very quietly, to cry. Behind him came another, and another, 50,000 of them filing out in ranks that had not been ordered, ranks that simply formed because 11 years of habit does not disappear even when everything else does. Nurses, engineers, pilots, riflemen. An entire expeditionary force that the history books had already buried, walking back into the light looking exactly as they had the day they left, down to the small scuff on a boot heel, down to a half-healed scar that should have finished healing a decade ago and instead looked 3 weeks old. Around Elena, the docking bay was filling with people who had no official reason to be there and every reason in the world. Word had traveled fast, the way it always does when something breaks the ordinary rules of the universe, and within 20 minutes of the first alert, the observation gallery above the bay was packed shoulder to shoulder with people who had once been told, gently, by grief counselors and casualty notification officers, that it was time to move forward. An elderly man in a faded cardigan gripped the railing with both hands, his knuckles white, scanning the ranks below for a face he had last seen as a young man's face, 22 years old, laughing at something just out of frame in the last photograph he owned. A woman in a nurse's uniform, off-duty, still wearing her hospital badge, pressed both palms flat against the viewport glass as if she could pull someone through it by will. Elle alone. Somewhere behind Alina, a child no older than 10 asked her mother, in the too loud voice children use when they do not yet understand that a room has gone quiet on purpose, "Is that really Daddy? Is that really him?" And the mother did not answer because she could not yet trust her own voice to answer. Alina would think later that this was the part of the story the news reports never quite captured. Not the scale of it, not the fleet returning or the diplomatic tremors that would follow for years, but the sheer, overwhelming weight of 11 years of private grief breaking open all at once, in public, in a cold gray docking bay that had never been built to hold something like this. She found Daniel in the 11th row. To understand what those 11 years had cost Alina, you would have needed to sit with her through any one of the 100 small humiliations that come with refusing, publicly and repeatedly, to accept a truth everyone else has agreed to live with. In the second year after the disappearance, a review board had summoned her to a windowless room 3 levels below Fleet Command headquarters and informed her, not unkindly, that the statistical probability of survivors from an engagement of that magnitude, after that length of silence, was effectively zero, and that continuing to classify 50,000 personnel as missing rather than deceased was placing an unsustainable burden on survivor benefits, on unit reorganization, on the closure that thousands of grieving families deserved and were being denied by a handful of holdouts who could not let go. Alina had sat through the entire presentation without interrupting, and at the end of it she had asked a single question. Had anyone actually found wreckage? Anyone? A single verified fragment of a single verified hull? The answer, as it had been every year before and would be every year after, was no. She had stood up, thanked the board for their time, and walked out, and the classification had remained, technically, unresolved, purely because she refused to sign the paperwork that would have closed it, and because, in a small mercy she never fully understood, no one with the authority to override her had ever quite found the will to do it over her objection. It cost her a promotion she had been in line for. It cost her, for a period of nearly 4 years, most of her friendships within Fleet Command, who found her refusal to move on exhausting to be around, a kind of standing reproach to their own quieter acceptance. It cost her, more than once, entire nights spent staring at the ceiling of the apartment with the second bedroom she never repurposed, wondering if she had simply built an elaborate structure of denial around herself because the alternative, accepting that Daniel was gone, that the last conversation they'd had was an argument about nothing in particular, about whose turn it was to call their mother, and that there would be no chance to take it back, was more than she knew how to carry. She had a ritual in those years that she never told anyone about. Not even the therapist command required her to see twice a year as a condition of continued active duty. On the anniversary of the disappearance, she would drive out past the edge of the base to a low ridge that overlooked the launch corridor, and she would sit there until the sun went down, and she would say, out loud to no one, the same thing every year. Not a prayer exactly. She did not think of herself as a religious woman. Closer to a promise renewed annually, the way some people renew a lease on a life they are not ready to give up. I am still here. The door is still open, whenever you're ready. Daniel was not the boy who had left. He was still 31 years old on the outside, still had the same crooked smile that had gotten him out of trouble their whole childhood, still walked with that same easy roll in his shoulders that had made him the best pilot in his class. But his eyes were different. There was something in them now that had not been there before, something that looked like it had traveled very far and seen things that did not translate easily into words. And when he saw her standing behind the viewport, He stopped walking entirely, and the whole procession behind him had to part around him like water around a stone. "Alina," he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable, the way it used to when he was 14 and had not yet learned to control it. She was through the security checkpoint before anyone could stop her, alarms be damned, and she crossed the docking bay floor at a dead run, and when she reached him she did not say anything at all. She simply held on, and he held on back, and for a long moment neither of them cared that they were standing in the middle of a docking bay full of soldiers and officials and cameras that had already begun to arrive, because 11 years is a long time to hold your breath, and some reunions do not have room in them for dignity. "Where were you?" she finally managed, pulling back just far enough to look at his face. "Daniel, where in God's name were you? It's been 11 years, you look," her voice broke. "You look exactly the same." Daniel looked past her, at the docking bay, at the flags, at the gray ceiling of a world he had not seen in over a decade, and there was something in his expression that was not quite joy and not quite grief. It was closer to disbelief. The specific, quiet disbelief of a man who has spent a very long time somewhere he did not expect to survive, and has come home to find that home kept living without him. "I don't know if you'll believe me," he said. "Try me," Alina said. "I've spent 11 years believing things nobody else would." He almost smiled at that, almost. "We were never in a battle," he said. "There was no ambush, Alina. There was no enemy fleet waiting for us in the Vale. We flew in, and then everything went white, and the next thing any of us knew, we were somewhere that shouldn't exist, being looked at by something that had been waiting a very, very long time for someone like us to arrive." That was where it began for Alina. Not the war, not the funeral she had refused to hold. This, a man she loved, unaged and unbroken, standing in a docking bay telling her that 11 years of grief had been built on a story that was not even close to true. To understand what happened to the Lyra Expeditionary Force, you have to go back to a war that most people outside the military remember only in headlines. The Vantar conflict, humanity's first and only large-scale war against another spacefaring civilization, fought across a stretch of contested territory that both sides called, for very different reasons, the Vale. It was not a war humanity started, and for a long time it was not a war humanity was sure it could survive. The Vantar Assembly was old, not ancient in the way legends describe ancient things, but old in the specific, documentable way of a civilization that had been building starships since before humanity had learned to smelt bronze. They had technology humanity did not understand. They had numbers humanity could not match. And for the first 2 years of the war, humanity did the only thing it has ever really known how to do when the odds turn against it. It endured, and it adapted, and it found ways to survive that should not have worked, and somehow did. The Lyra Expeditionary Force was humanity's answer to a Vantar incursion that threatened to break the entire eastern flank of Allied territory. 50,000 soldiers, sailors, and support personnel across a fleet of 112 vessels, sent to hold a choke point in the Vale long enough for the rest of the fleet to regroup. It was, by every strategic estimate at the time, close to a suicide mission. They went anyway. That is what soldiers do, and it is worth pausing here, before the story moves further, to say plainly that there is a particular kind of courage in walking toward odds you know are bad, not because you believe you will win, but because someone has to buy the time, and you have decided it will be you. They flew into the Vale on a gray morning that nobody who watched them leave will ever forget, and they never came out the other side. Long-range sensors registered a burst of energy inconsistent with any known weapon signature, and then nothing. No wreckage was ever found. No transmissions were ever received. For 11 years, the leading theory, the theory command had eventually, reluctantly, publicly settled on, over Alina's repeated objections, was that the Lyra Expeditionary Force had been annihilated by some undocumented Vantar superweapon, vaporized so completely that not even debris remained. The war itself had begun, as so many wars do, with a misunderstanding that neither side had been willing to walk back from before it hardened into something irreversible. A human survey ship, 3 years before the Lyra Expeditionary Force ever launched, had drifted into a system the Vantar Assembly considered sovereign territory under a treaty humanity had never seen and had no way of knowing existed. The Vantar response had been swift and, by their own cultural standards, entirely proportionate. A warning strike across the survey ship's bow, meant to communicate territorial boundaries, the way the Vantar had communicated them to a dozen other young species before humanity. Humanity, having no framework for interpreting an unprovoked weapons discharge as a diplomatic gesture, had interpreted it instead as an act of war and had responded accordingly. By the time either side understood how badly the signals had been crossed, ships had already been lost, and pride, that old, familiar, species-spanning obstacle to peace, had made it nearly impossible for either government to simply admit the mistake and stand down. For 2 years, the war ground on across a dozen contested systems. And it was, by any honest accounting, a war humanity was losing. The Vantar Assembly ships were faster, their weapons more refined, their logistics honed by centuries of interstellar expansion that gave them an institutional patience humanity's younger, more improvisational fleets simply could not match. What humanity had instead was a stubbornness that Vantar tacticians found genuinely difficult to model. Human commanders held indefensible positions past the point of reasonable calculation, not because doctrine demanded it, but because someone needed the extra 6 hours, and someone was willing to give it to them. Human engineers kept broken ships flying with jury-rigged repairs that violated every safety principle in the manual, because the alternative was leaving crewmates stranded. It was not, in the early years, a war humanity was winning. But it was a war humanity refused, again and again, to simply lose gracefully, and that refusal bought time for alliances to form, for tactics to adapt, for a young and outmatched species to learn, the hard way, how to survive against an enemy who had assumed the war would be short. The Lyra Expeditionary Force had been humanity's answer to a critical moment in that long, grinding conflict, and it is worth understanding, before the story moves on, exactly what kind of mission it had actually been. Intelligence had detected a major Vantar buildup moving toward the eastern flank, aimed at a logistics corridor that, if lost, would have cut off supply lines to nearly a third of humanity's forward positions. There was no way to reinforce that flank in time through conventional means. The only option Fleet Command had was to send a force into the Veil itself, the dense, sensor-scrambling nebula that separated the two fleets, and hold a narrow choke point long enough for the rest of the Allied fleet to redeploy around it. Every officer who signed off on the mission understood, privately, that the casualty projections were catastrophic. Commander Priya Anand, who would go on to lead the Lyra Expeditionary Force through everything that followed, had reportedly told her own executive officer, the night before departure, that she did not expect to see the following spring. She flew into the Veil anyway, and 50,000 people flew in with her, because the alternative was watching a third of humanity's forward defenses collapse from a position of safety, and none of them were built for that kind of safety. The truth, as Daniel would eventually tell it in pieces, over the course of many long conversations that Alina would spend the rest of her life being grateful for, was stranger than any weapon. The Veil was not empty space. It never had been. Both humanity and the Vantar Assembly had fought over it for years without either side fully understanding what it actually was, because neither side had bothered or been able to look closely enough. Buried at the gravitational center of the nebula, cloaked behind layers of ionized gas and centuries of accumulated stellar debris, there was something the Vantar had detected only faintly and humanity had not detected at all: an artifact. Not a weapon in any sense either species would have recognized. A vessel, ancient beyond any dating method either civilization possessed, silent for so long that both sides had simply assumed, when their scanners returned strange readings, that they were picking up geological anomalies in the nebula's dense core. It was not a geological anomaly, it was a mind. Daniel would later struggle, more than once, to describe it to Alina in words that did it justice. And Alina would come to understand that this struggle was not a failure of memory, but a genuine limitation of language. That some things simply happen to a person in a way that cannot be fully carried back out into the ordinary world. The way you cannot carry the ocean home in a cup and expect someone to understand what it felt like to be beneath it. It called itself, eventually, once it had learned enough of our language to bother with names, the Warden, Daniel told her, 3 days after his return, sitting across from her in a small gray room that Command had assigned for what they clinically called reintegration debriefing, though Alina privately thought of it as something closer to a vigil. It had been built, grown, maybe. Built isn't really the right word, by a species that doesn't exist anymore. A species that was gone before either us or the Vantar had learned to walk upright. And its job, the only job it had ever had, for longer than either of our civilizations have existed, was to watch. Watch for what? Alina asked. For someone worth watching, Daniel said. Its makers built it to wait at the crossroads of expanding civilizations and to observe what happened when two young species that didn't understand each other collided. Not to interfere, just to watch and to record and to decide, eventually, when it had enough data, what to do with what it found. And it pulled you in. It pulled all of us in, Daniel said. Every ship, every soul, the second we crossed into its detection field. Not to kill us. It never wanted to kill us, Alina. That's the thing nobody back home is going to want to hear. It pulled us in because we were about to fight a battle inside its territory, and it wanted to know why. It wanted to understand what we were before it let history keep happening around it. This is where the story could have ended in tragedy, and very nearly did. Because what the Warden found in that first year was not encouraging. Daniel described it carefully, later. In the version of the story he eventually let Alina record for the official archive. Though even that version left things out, things Alina suspected he would carry privately for the rest of his life, the way soldiers often do. The Lyra Expeditionary Force had woken inside the Warden's vessel disoriented, terrified, and armed. Nearly a third of them had been Vantar prisoners of war at the time of the pull, soldiers and support crew captured during a running engagement 2 systems away, taken along with the fleet that had been transporting them. And suddenly, humans and Vantar found themselves imprisoned together in a place neither of them understood. Still, in that first confused week, very much inclined to keep trying to kill each other. There had been violence. Daniel did not shy away from that part, though it clearly cost him something to say it out loud. There had been fear and mistrust, and at least one incident in the first month that had cost lives on both sides, before anyone in either fleet understood what had actually happened to them. The Warden had watched all of it, recorded all of it. And Daniel would later learn, from something the Warden itself eventually told him, that in those first months it had genuinely believed it was watching the confirmation of an old and terrible pattern, that it had seen this exact story before, on other crossroads with other young species, and it had almost always ended the same way. It told me later that it had already begun drafting its judgment, Daniel said. That there was a process, I don't fully understand it, some kind of final determination it was built to make, about whether a species that behaves this way at first contact deserves to keep expanding into the galaxy unsupervised, or whether it needs to be contained. Stopped. It never told me exactly what that would have meant for us. I don't think I wanted to know. Alina would meet Commander Anand herself, eventually, at a small private gathering Daniel arranged nearly 2 months after the return, and she would understand within minutes of the conversation why 50,000 people, human and Vantar alike, had followed this woman's judgment through the strangest and most dangerous circumstance any of them would ever face. Anand was not a large presence in any physical sense, a compact, gray-haired woman in her early 60s, by the time count that mattered to her body, with a quiet, unhurried way of speaking that made you lean in rather than the reverse. She had entered the war. She told Elena over tea that neither of them drank much of, not because she believed in the righteousness of humanity's cause over the Vantars, but because she believed, simply and without much complication, in the people under her command, and in her responsibility to bring as many of them home as she possibly could. When we were pulled into that place, Anand said, I had exactly one job as I understood it, and it had nothing to do with fighting anyone. My job was to keep as many of my people alive as I could, for as long as I could, until I understood the shape of the danger we were actually in. And within the first week, I understood that the danger wasn't each other, and it wasn't even the thing that had taken us. The danger was what we might become, trapped together with no clear way out, if we let fear make our decisions for us. I've commanded through combat, Colonel. I know what fear does to good people when it's given enough time and enough silence to work with. I wasn't going to give it either. It was, Daniel said, a woman named Commander Priya Anand, the ranking officer of the Lyra Expeditionary Force, and the person Daniel would later credit, without hesitation, with saving every single life aboard that ship, human and Vantar both, who changed the direction of everything. Commander Anand had done something that should not have worked, and that nobody had ordered her to do, and that very nearly got her relieved of command by her own subordinates in the panic of those first weeks. She had ordered her people to stand down, not to surrender. There was no one to surrender to, not yet, not in any way they understood, but to stop fighting the Vantar prisoners who shared their captivity, to treat the wounded on both sides, to share what little medical supplies and rations they had, and to wait. She used to say something to us, Daniel told Elena, and here his voice thickened in a way it had not thickened even when describing the violence. She used to say, we didn't come out here to prove we could kill better than the thing that's watching us. We came out here to prove we're worth watching at all. And if this is a test, and by then we all understood somehow that it was a test, even before anyone explained the rules to us, then the only way to fail it is to become exactly the thing it's afraid we are. Life inside the Warden's vessel in those middle years settled into something Daniel struggled to describe without sounding as though he were minimizing the horror of it, because it was not horror, not most days. It was something stranger, an improvised makeshift ordinariness, built by 50,000 humans and several hundred Vantar out of sheer necessity, because a species cannot sustain terror indefinitely, and eventually, whether captors intend it or not, captives begin to build lives inside even the strangest of cages. Commander Anand established rotating work details, not because the Warden required labor of them, but because idle hands and idle minds, she said, were the fastest route back to the fear and violence of those first weeks. Human engineers taught Vantar engineers about human hydroponics. Vantar botanists, in turn, introduced strains of nutrient-dense fungus that kept both crews fed long after their original rations had been exhausted. A ship's cook named Havorson, formerly of a supply vessel nobody outside the fleet had ever heard of, began hosting something the crew came to call, half-jokingly, the Sunday table, a shared meal, held on whatever day the crew's improvised calendar called Sunday, where humans and Vantar sat together and traded stories about the worlds they had left behind. And Daniel said that some of his clearest memories of the whole captivity were not of fear or crisis at all, but of laughing. Genuinely laughing at a Vantar supply officer's deadpan impression of a human drill sergeant he had only ever seen from the wrong end of a rifle. There were births even. 2 children were born inside the Warden's vessel during those years, to couples who had been married before the deployment, and Daniel said that the day of the first birth was the closest thing the entire fleet had to a holiday for the rest of the captivity. Everyone, human and Vantar alike, finding some reason to pass by the medical bay, to leave some small handmade token outside the door, to simply stand near the news of a new life beginning in a place that had, not so long before, felt like the end of every life inside it. It was, Daniel said, the moment even the most stubborn holdouts on both sides began to understand that they were not merely surviving together anymore. They were, whether they had chosen it or not, becoming a single strange and unlikely community, bound by circumstance into something that neither government back home would have believed possible. It took months. Alina would learn later that this was one of the strangest parts of the whole account. That time inside the Warden's vessel had passed differently than time outside it, that 11 years in the ordinary universe had been, for the 50,000 souls trapped within it, closer to 4. Still, an enormous span of time to live inside a single sealed vessel with your former enemies, waiting to learn whether you would be allowed to go home, or whether you would ever be allowed to leave at all. But shorter than the 11 years, the rest of humanity had spent mourning them. Slowly and not without setbacks, something began to change. It began small, the way most real changes do. A human medic named Osai, whom Daniel spoke of with an unmistakable warmth every time her name came up, had spent the better part of 2 months teaching herself enough of the Vantar field medical dialect to treat a wounded Vantar officer who had been left to fend for himself by his own commanding officers, who considered him a liability now that he was a prisoner. She had not been ordered to do it. She had simply seen a wounded person and done what medics do. The Vantar officer, whose name was Threnkal, had initially refused her help out of what Daniel described as a mixture of pride and genuine confusion. The Vantar, it turned out, had a rigid cultural expectation that mercy between enemies was either a trap or a weakness, and Threnkal did not know which one he was being offered and trusted neither. Osai kept coming back anyway. Daniel said that was the part that changed things, not one grand gesture but the sheer, stubborn repetition of it. Day after day, she returned and cleaned his wounds and asked nothing of him in return, until eventually Threnkal began, haltingly, to talk to her. And through Threnkal, other Vantar prisoners began, one at a time, to reconsider what they had assumed. They understood about the strange, aggressive young species they had been fighting. Daniel told Alina once, late at night, in the kind of hushed voice people use for the memories they have turned over so many times they have gone smooth, that he had asked Osai directly, in those first difficult months, why she kept going back to a man who had shot at people wearing the same uniform she wore. He said she had looked at him with something like mild surprise, as if the question had never actually occurred to her as a question, and had said simply, "He stopped being an enemy the moment he needed help, and I was the only one who could give it. I don't know how to explain that any better than that. I just don't have a version of myself that walks past somebody bleeding." Daniel said he had thought about that answer more times than he could count in the years that followed, and that it had, in its own small way, become something like the unofficial creed of the whole fleet. Not a policy handed down by Commander Anand, though she certainly encouraged it, but something that simply spread from person to person the way real conviction spreads, by example rather than by order. It was not universally embraced, and Daniel was careful, in telling the story, never to pretend otherwise. There were humans aboard who never forgave the Vantar for the friends they had lost in the opening skirmishes of the war, and who kept their distance for the entire duration of the captivity, speaking to their former enemies only when duty required it. There were Vantar prisoners, too, who regarded every human kindness as a manipulation, a softening tactic designed to make them compliant, and who waited, for months and then years, for the trap to finally spring. Threnkal himself admitted much later that for a long time he had assumed Osai's persistence was itself a kind of psychological warfare, calculated and cold beneath its warm exterior, and that it was not until he caught her, quite by accident, weeping alone in a supply corridor over the death of a human crewmate he barely knew, that he finally understood her kindness carried no strategy in it at all. It was simply who she was, offered freely, with no accounting kept. The Warden, all the while, watched everything. Daniel had his own encounters with it early on, that he did not share easily even with Alina. The Warden did not have a face, not in any sense a human mind could easily hold onto. It communicated, in those first months, through shifting patterns of light along the walls of the vast chamber that held the combined fleets, and through a voice that seemed to originate from everywhere in a room at once, low and resonant and utterly without inflection, the way water sounds the same whether it is glad or grieving. It asked questions. Not interrogation, exactly. Daniel was careful about that word, because it implied a hostility that was not quite present even in those early, uncertain months. It asked the kind of questions a very old and very patient scholar might ask a subject it did not yet understand and was in no hurry to misjudge. It asked me once, fairly early on, why I hadn't tried to escape, Daniel told her. There were parts of the vessel that weren't sealed. Not because it was careless, I understood later that it was testing us, seeing what we'd do with the openings it left. I told it the truth. I said escape didn't mean anything if it meant leaving people behind, and I wasn't going to leave anyone behind. It didn't say anything back for a long time after that. I remember thinking I'd said something wrong. And then it just said, "That is not the answer I expected," and it left. I didn't understand until much later that that was the first real crack in what it had already decided about us. It told me it had never seen anything like it, Daniel said. Not the medicine. It had seen medicine before on 100 worlds. It was the persistence of it, it said. The fact that we kept choosing kindness even after it stopped being useful to us. Even after it would have been easier and safer to stop. It said most young species it had observed extended mercy only as long as it served a strategic purpose, and abandoned it the moment the calculation changed. It said we were the first crew in longer than it could easily express to us in a way we'd understand who kept extending it past the point where it made any sense at all. There is a particular kind of turning point in every good story. A moment where everything that has been building quietly beneath the surface finally breaks into the open. And for the Lyra Expeditionary Force, that moment came roughly 2 years into their captivity, roughly 6 years, in the outside universe's accounting, when the Warden itself began, for the first time, to fail. It had been alone a very long time. Longer, Daniel would come to understand, than either humanity or the Vantar Assembly could easily comprehend, alone since before either species existed, alone through the long silent centuries of its assigned vigil, alone in a way that even its makers, whoever and whatever they had been, had perhaps not fully anticipated when they built it and left it at the crossroads to wait. Machines are not supposed to grow lonely. And yet something in the Warden's ancient architecture had, over unfathomable spans of time, begun very slowly to degrade. Not its intelligence, not its judgment, but something closer to what a human would call its will. Whole systems that had once monitored dozens of star systems simultaneously had gone dark, one by one, over the millennia, not through damage but through a kind of accumulated exhaustion that had no name in any language humanity possessed. Daniel described the day it happened the way people describe the day a hospital calls with bad news, flatly, carefully, as though speaking too much emotion into the memory might break something in himself that had only just finished healing. The lights went out, he said. All through the ship, that's what we called it, though I don't think ship is really the right word for what the Warden actually was. All through it, section by section, things just started failing. Life support in the outer decks, gravity in half the corridors. And we realized all of us at once, human and Vantar both, that the thing keeping us alive was dying, and if it died completely, we were going to die with it, trapped inside whatever was left of it forever. It would have been easy, Alina thought later, listening to this part of the story, for that realization to send both crews straight back into the fear and violence of those first terrible weeks. Instead, something else happened. Something that Daniel clearly still had trouble fully explaining, even years, even, subjectively, only months after living through it. Commander Anand had gathered every engineer in both crews, human and Vantar, and had asked them to do something that no military protocol on either side had ever prepared them for, to save the life of the thing that had imprisoned them. There were people who argued we shouldn't, Daniel admitted. On both sides. Vantar officers who said we should let it die and use the chaos to force our way out. A few of our own people said the same thing, honestly, that after everything it had done to us, taking 2 years, 4 years of our lives without asking, we didn't owe it anything. Commander Annan didn't argue with them, not really. She just asked one question. She said, if we let something die because it's easier than saving it, what exactly have we proven about what we are? And I don't think there was a good answer to that question. I don't think there ever is. It was not without cost. Daniel spoke only once and only briefly about a young engineer named Corporal Michael Reyes, 23 years old, who had been part of the team working to reroute power through a section of the failing vessel that no one fully understood, and who had been caught in a containment collapse that no amount of caution could have predicted, because the systems they were working on had no manual, no precedent, nothing but guesswork built on guesswork. Reyes did not survive. Daniel had helped carry him out of that corridor himself, and he told Alina that it was, without question, the lowest point of the entire captivity, lower than the fear of the first weeks, lower than the despair of watching the lights go out section by section. Because it was the moment several people, understandably, began to ask out loud whether they were dying for a machine that had stolen years of their lives and offered nothing but silence in return. Commander Annan had held a funeral for Reyes in the largest open chamber of the vessel, with full honors, humans and Vantar both standing in formation, and Daniel said that Threnkal, entirely unprompted, had stepped forward at the end of the service and recited a mourning verse from his own culture, one traditionally reserved only for warriors who died defending their own people, because, he said afterward, he had come to understand that Reyes had died defending people who were no longer strangers to him, in any sense that mattered. It was, Daniel said, the moment he finally stopped thinking of the Vantar prisoners as prisoners at all, and started thinking of them as something closer to kin, forged by circumstance rather than blood. So they worked. For weeks and then months, human engineers and Vantar engineers who 11 years, 6 years, earlier had been trying to kill each other across a battlefield, now stood shoulder to shoulder in the failing corridors of an alien intelligence older than either of their civilizations, trying to understand a technology that predated language itself, trying to keep it alive with nothing but salvaged parts, borrowed expertise, and a stubbornness that Daniel would later describe, with something like reverence, as the only real weapon either crew had ever needed. They succeeded. Not completely, the Warden, Daniel said, was never quite what it had been before. Some part of it dimmed permanently in a way that even the combined ingenuity of 2 species could not fully repair, but they stabilized what remained. They kept the lights on. They kept it, in whatever sense applied to something like the Warden, alive. And it was in the quiet after that crisis, in the strange and unlikely peace that had settled over a vessel that had begun as a prison and slowly become something closer to a shared home, that the Warden finally spoke to them not as a judge, but as something closer to a grateful equal. It told us it had made its determination, Daniel said, and here, for the first time since he had come home, Alina watched her brother's composure genuinely threaten to break. It told us it had been prepared, when we first arrived, to conclude that we were what it called an unstable variable, a species too young and too violent to be permitted to keep growing unsupervised, the same conclusion it had reluctantly reached about at least 2 other civilizations across its long watch, civilizations that no longer exist because of what that conclusion meant. And it told us that everything it had watched us do, since that first terrible month, the mercy, the stubbornness, the way we chose, over and over, when it would have been easier not to save something that had never once asked to be saved by us, had made that judgment impossible to sustain. It said, and I remember this exactly, because I don't think I'll ever forget it as long as I live, it said, I have watched civilizations rise and end for longer than either of your histories can measure, and I had begun to believe that kindness without incentive was a story young species tell themselves, and not a thing they actually do, when no one is left to reward them for it. You have unmade the oldest and saddest conclusion I have ever reached. I do not know how to properly thank you for that. But I know how to send you home. Alina did not speak for a long moment after Daniel said that. Outside the small gray room, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the base going on around them, footsteps, distant voices, the low hum of ventilation. And it struck her, with a force that nearly took her breath away, how strange it was that the universe had simply kept moving through all of this, indifferent and unaware, while her brother lived through something that had, in its own quiet way, rewritten what an ancient and dying mind believed about an entire species. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why did it wait 11 years, 6 years, whatever it actually was for you, to let you go? If it had already decided you deserved to live, why not send you back the moment it decided?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Because it wasn't strong enough," he said. "Not for a long time after the crisis. Sending us home, actually reversing what happened to pull us in, across that kind of distance, through whatever it used to do at the first time, took more of its remaining strength than anything else it had ever attempted. It told us, honestly, that there was a real chance the effort would finish what the years of isolation had already started, that it might not survive sending us back at all. Commander Annan offered to let it wait, to let it rebuild its strength over more years if it needed to, rather than risk itself for us. It refused. It said something I don't think I'll ever be able to explain properly to anyone who wasn't there. It said, "I have spent longer than your species has existed learning what it means to be worth saving. I would rather spend what remains of myself proving I learned the lesson than keep it safely, and never use it at all." And so, last night, in a single convulsive burst of ancient and failing power, the Warden had sent 50,000 human souls and several hundred Vantar prisoners of war, who had, in the years of their shared captivity, become something considerably more complicated and more precious than prisoners, home, across a distance neither science yet fully understood, into a universe that had spent 11 years believing them dead. Nobody knew, in the days that followed, whether the Warden itself had survived the effort. There was no way to know. The Veil, when scanning ships were finally dispatched to investigate, months later, showed no trace of any artificial structure at its gravitational heart at all. Only the same dense, silent nebula gas that had concealed it for untold ages before humanity or the Vantar Assembly had ever laid eyes on it. Whether that meant the Warden had died in the act of setting them free, or whether it had simply, finally, after so long a vigil, allowed itself to power down and rest, was a question Daniel said he thought about every single day, and one that he suspected he would never get to answer. What was certain, what could not be argued, away by any skeptical official or any cautious diplomat in the weeks of chaos that followed the Lyra Expeditionary Force's return, was the other part of what came home with them, because the fleet had not returned alone. Several hundred Vantar soldiers, the same soldiers who had once been prisoners of war and had, over years of shared hardship, become something closer to comrades, had chosen, when the moment came, to return with the humans rather than be sent back to Vantar space. Threnkal was among them. When Alina finally met him, 3 weeks after the return, in a quiet meeting room that command had reluctantly arranged at Daniel's insistence, the Vantar officer studied her for a long moment with eyes that were nothing like human eyes, and then said, through the translator unit at his throat, in a voice that was slow and careful and clearly still practicing a language he had only recently begun to learn, "Your brother is the reason I am alive. I did not understand before why your people fought the way you did, refusing to let each other be sacrificed, refusing to let the enemy die when it would have cost you nothing to let it happen. I understand now. I have never seen anything like it in any of my people's long history. I do not think we ever will again, unless we learn it from you." Alina did not know what to say to that at first. She had spent 11 years thinking of the Vantar Assembly as an abstraction, a distant and faceless enemy responsible for the years she had lost with her brother. And it was strange and unsettling and, in its own way, healing, to sit across from one of them and hear, in halting and careful words, that he owed his life to the same brother she had spent 11 years refusing to bury. "Thank you," she finally said, because it was the only true thing she could think to say. "For staying with him, for whatever part you played in bringing him home to me." Threnkal considered this for a long moment. In the deliberate way Alina would come to understand was simply how his people processed weighty things, unwilling to offer a response before they had turned it over fully. "I did not do it for you," he said finally. "I did not know you existed, Colonel, until your brother spoke of you many times in the dark hours when neither of us could sleep. I did it because your brother did not stop being decent to me even when decency was inconvenient, and I found over time that I did not want to be the kind of person who let that go unanswered." He paused, and something in his posture shifted, an easing Alina would only later learn to read correctly on a face so unlike her own. "May I tell you something I have not told him?" he asked. "In the earliest days, before the medic Osai began her visits, I had already decided how I would die, not from despair, from calculation. I believed capture by your species meant slow interrogation, and I had resolved to give my captors nothing, and to end things myself before that resolve could be tested and broken. I held a blade I had hidden through the confusion of our capture, and I intended to use it on the third night. Os found me before I made my decision, and treated a wound I had not even asked her to treat, and left without asking anything of me at all. I did not use the blade that night, or the night after. By the time I might have used it, I no longer wanted to. I tell you this not to unsettle you, but so you understand exactly how much your brother's kindness and hers actually weighed. It was not a pleasant gesture, Colonel. For me, it was the difference between existing and not existing at all." Alina sat with that for a long moment, feeling the full weight of it settle over her. The understanding that the years she had spent grieving a brother who was, unbeknownst to her, quietly saving lives across an unbridgeable gulf of language and history and war, had been years spent underestimating exactly what kind of man he had grown into while she wasn't watching. "He never told me that part," she said finally. "He would not," Threnkal said. "It is not a story he tells about himself. It is a story only those of us who lived it can tell about him. I thought perhaps someone who loves him should know it." The weeks that followed the return were not simple for anyone. Reintegration, Alina learned quickly, was not a matter of paperwork and medical scans, though there was plenty of both. 50,000 people had to relearn in real time how to live in a world that had spent 11 years without them. A world with new technologies they had never trained on, new political alignments they had never voted in, children who had grown into adults, parents who had grown old or passed away entirely while their sons and daughters remained, cruelly, exactly as young as the day they left. Daniel told her about a young private in his unit, barely 20 when the fleet departed, who had returned to find that his newborn daughter, glimpsed only. In a single photograph he had carried through the entire captivity, was now a young woman of 11, taller than her own mother, who did not recognize the man in her baby pictures as the same person standing in her living room, and who needed months of careful, patient rebuilding before she could call him anything warmer than Sir. The public reaction, too, was not uniformly joyful, though joy was, by far, the dominant note. There were journalists who demanded to know why Fleet Command had been so quick to declare 50,000 people dead, and hearings that Alina was called to testify at more than once, describing in exhausting detail every appeal she had filed and every board that had denied her. There were skeptics in the first chaotic days who doubted the entire account, who suggested the returning soldiers were imposters, or the victims of some elaborate Vantar deception designed to seed spies throughout human territory, a theory that collapsed quickly under the weight of medical verification, but that nonetheless forced Daniel and thousands like him to submit to weeks of additional scrutiny before they were permitted to simply go home and grieve, and heal, and begin the long work of becoming ordinary people again. But beneath all of it, in the quiet spaces between hearings and scans and news cycles, something gentler was happening, all across human territory, in 10,000 small rooms that no camera ever entered. Families who had built their lives around absence were relearning how to build them around presence instead, a transition that turned out, against all expectation, to be its own kind of difficult, its own kind of grief, because you cannot simply erase 11 years of a shape carved into your life by someone's absence and slide the real person back into it as though no time had passed at all. Alina found, in the months that followed, that she and Daniel had to slowly, deliberately, rebuild a relationship that could not simply pick up where it had left off, because she was no longer the same woman who had said goodbye to him at 29, and though he wore the same face he had worn then, he was not the same man either, not after what he had lived through, not after the years, however strangely counted, that had reshaped him from the inside in ways she was only beginning to understand. The diplomatic consequences of the Lyra Expeditionary Force's return would take years to fully unfold, and they are, in their own way, a different story, one of tentative peace talks between humanity and the Vantar Assembly, brokered in no small part by soldiers on both sides who had once been enemies and had, in the strangest and most unlikely of circumstances, become something else entirely. That story is still being written, even now, in council chambers and border negotiations across a dozen contested systems, and it is not this story's place to finish it. This story belongs to a docking bay on a cold gray moon called Perrin's Anchor, and to a woman who spent 11 years refusing to bury a brother the rest of the world had already mourned, and to the look on his face when he finally understood that she had never once stopped believing he might come home. "I used to think you'd given up on me," Daniel told her, weeks later, sitting on the small balcony of the apartment she had never let anyone else move into, the one with the second bedroom she had never repurposed, not once in 11 years, though everyone had told her she should. "Command told me when we finally got debriefed that most of the families had accepted the official finding, moved on. I understood it honestly. 11 years is a long time to keep a door open for someone who might never walk back through it." "I never accepted it," Alina said. "Not for one day, not because I had some kind of proof or some kind of faith I can explain to you. I refused to let the last thing I knew about you be a guess made by people who weren't there. I decided that if I was going to be wrong, I was going to be wrong on the side of believing in you, and not the other way around." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that Alina would carry with her for the rest of her life. The particular, quiet gratitude of a person who has learned, the hard way, in the coldest and strangest of circumstances, exactly how rare it is to be believed in without evidence, exactly how much that belief is worth to the person on the other end of it, even when, especially when, they have no way of knowing it is there. "The warden used to ask me about you," he said quietly. "Near the end, it had learned to read some of our memories. In the deepest debriefing sessions it ran on all of us, trying to understand us better. It found the ones with you interesting. It said, and I think about this more than almost anything else it ever told me, it said that in all its long watch, across all the young and violent species it had observed, rising and falling at the crossroads, it had never once seen a mind capable of holding a door open, unwavering, for 11 years, with no proof the door would ever be walked back through. It said that if it had needed only one piece of evidence to reach its final judgment about humanity, it might have chosen that. There was a wall on the main concourse of Fleet Command headquarters that Alina had walked past almost every day for 11 years without ever quite managing to look at directly. It was a memorial wall, added 18 months after the disappearance, over Alina's strenuous and ultimately unsuccessful objection, listing the names of the Lyra Expeditionary Force beneath a single carved line that read, in letters she had long ago memorized against her will, "Their light reached us longer than they did." She had hated that wall with a quiet, private intensity she had never fully explained to anyone, because it had always felt to her less like a memorial and more like a verdict, carved in stone before the trial had finished, before all the evidence was in. 3 weeks after the return, she took Daniel to see it. He had asked to go, actually. He wanted, he said, to see his own name carved into a wall meant for the dead, because there was something about it he needed to understand, some shape of the grief the rest of the world had carried for him that he could not fully grasp until he had stood in front of the physical proof of it. They found his name together, near the bottom of the 11th column, Daniel R. VOSS, Lieutenant, and beneath it the same short, impersonal line repeated 50,000 times across the wall with only the names changed. Daniel reached out and touched the letters of his own name for a long time without speaking. Elena stood beside him and did not fill the silence, because some silences are not hers to fill. "I keep thinking about all the people who don't get this," he finally said. "The ones who really don't come back, whose names stay on walls like this forever and nobody ever gets to stand in front of them and touch the letters and say, actually, not yet, not me. I don't know what to do with being one of the lucky ones. I don't think I'm supposed to feel guilty about it, but I do, a little, every day since we got back." "You don't have to earn it," Elena told him, and she found, saying it, that she believed it completely. "You don't have to justify surviving to anyone, Daniel. Not to me. Not to the people who didn't. The only thing you owe the people on this wall is the same thing you'd have wanted from them if it had gone the other way, to actually live the life you got handed back, not to spend it apologizing for having it." He was quiet for a long moment, still looking at his own name. "Command's already talking about taking the wall down," he said eventually. "Now that we're back, some kind of ceremony replacing it with something else. I asked them not to. I told them to leave it exactly where it is, exactly as it says, not for me. For everyone else whose name is still going to be on a wall like this somewhere, in some other war, some other silence. I want people to remember that impossible things happen. I want somebody standing where I'm standing, 20 years from now, in front of a name they've already grieved, to have a reason to keep hoping instead of a reason to stop." A year later, Elena stood in the gallery of a converted assembly chamber on neutral ground between human and Vantar territory, watching the first formal ceasefire talks in the history of the two species open with something that had never once happened in the whole grinding course of the war. A joint statement, read aloud by a human admiral and a Vantar high envoy standing shoulder to shoulder at the same podium, describing what had happened in the Vale not as a footnote to the conflict, but as its unlikely turning point. The Vantar envoy, an elder stateswoman named Toon, who had lost a son in the war's opening year, and had, by her own account, spent a decade believing peace with humanity, was neither possible nor especially desirable, spoke for a long time about Threnkal and the others who had returned changed, about what it meant for an old and cautious civilization to be handed, by its own captured soldiers. Undeniable proof that the enemy it had spent years dismissing as reckless and young was also capable of a patience and a mercy that put much older cultures to shame. "We do not make peace today because we have stopped fearing each other," Toon said, in words that would be quoted for years afterward across a dozen worlds. "We make peace because a machine older than either of our histories looked at 50,000 of your people, held captive alongside several hundred of mine, and could not, in the end, tell us apart in the ways that mattered. That is not a small thing to learn about an enemy. I do not know that my people would have learned it any other way." Daniel was not in the room for that speech. He had, by then, quietly stepped back from active service, unable to fully explain even to Elena why he needed distance from uniforms and chains of command after everything he had lived through, and had instead taken a position teaching young cadets at the flight academy where he himself had once trained. a decision Alina privately thought suited him better than any of the medal's command kept trying to give him. But he listened to a recording of it that night, sitting on the same small balcony where he had first told her about the memorial wall, and when it finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I keep waiting to feel like the war meant something," he finally said. "Not the veil, I know what that meant, I lived what that meant. The actual war, the years before, Ray's, everyone else who didn't come back from other engagements, other battles that weren't lucky enough to end up in front of something like the Warden. I don't think that feeling's ever going to arrive, honestly. I think some losses just stay losses, no matter how good the ending turns out to be for the people who happen to survive them." "Maybe that's all right," Alina said. "Maybe you're not supposed to make the losses mean something. Maybe you're just supposed to make sure what comes after them is worth what they cost. You don't owe Ray's an explanation for why he died. You owe him a life that was worth him dying to protect. I think you're already giving him that. I think you have been, every day since you got back." There is a temptation, in stories like this one, to end on the scale of history, on treaties and fleets, and the slow turning of two civilizations away from war and toward something more complicated and more hopeful. And that is, in its own right, a true and important part of what happened in the Veil. But if you have ever waited for someone, really waited, the kind of waiting that costs you something every single day it continues, the kind of waiting the rest of the world eventually stops understanding and starts quietly pitying, then perhaps the real heart of this story is smaller than any treaty, and lives instead in a docking bay on a cold gray moon, in the space between two people who refused, against every reasonable expectation, to let go of each other. Humanity did not earn its place in that ancient, exhausted mind's final judgment through strength, or through cleverness, or through any weapon it had ever built. It earned it through the unglamorous, unrewarded, exhausting discipline of choosing kindness when no one was going to thank them for it, and through the quiet, stubborn faith of the people back home who refused to stop believing their soldiers might still be out there, somewhere, waiting to come back. If you have ever waited years for someone you loved, then perhaps you understand, better than most, what it means when the silence finally breaks. And if this story stayed with you the way it stayed with the people who lived it, consider sharing it with someone who still believes that hope is worth the wait.